It's not often you have the privilege of interviewing Professor Romila Thapar. And it's not often that you have the privilege of introducing her, or paradoxically, not introducing her because she needs no introduction. She straddled 9 decades as a historian, as a public intellectual, as a teacher, as a pillar of what was India's best known and most important university for the liberal arts, the Jawaharlal Nehru University. She was one of the pillars of that university. And she's often been attacked, for writing what I would call secular and plural history, as opposed to those who feel that she has written one line of history. Actually, if you see her work, the development of her ideas and her thoughts, and as she mentions in her new and very lovely autobiography, Just Being, which I'm showing to you, is something which shows in her 6-7 decades as a historian how she's grown as a public intellectual. Anyway, it's not for me to pronounce any judgment. I'm going to go straight to questions and ask first thank Professor Romila Thapar for being with us in Frontline today.
Thank you.
My first question to you, Professor Thapar: you were judged substandard, within quotes, when you sat for an entrance examination for the Oxford University. Did that shape the formidable body of work that followed?
No, not at all. In fact, I am sometimes rather surprised when I think back on it, how unperturbed I was by this evaluation. I think it was partly because I then decided to carry on and do what I really wanted to do, and fiddled around with various subjects and topics and so on, and finally arrived at wanting to do history. And then, of course, the decision was, which history should one do? And some people advised me to do European history, go abroad and study European history and come back and teach it, because there were no teachers. And others said, well, Indian history is always open to reinterpretation, so you could do that as well. And so that was really what my interest moved towards, looking once again at Indian history.
So, but do you think you were very influenced by Western universities at that time, or
No.
was that the only option open as really at that time?
No, we were not very. Most people, of course, went to Oxbridge and did the usual kinds of degrees, but then very often they didn't become teachers of history. They went into other fields. My interest was really partly conditioned by the fact that this was all in some ways new. It's the way that they were handling history in the SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and the kinds of emphases that they were giving was very different from the kind of history that we had studied here. And I got quite interested in looking at that.
And why ancient history, and why not medieval or modern? What was in your mind when you chose that?
I think there were two things. One was that ancient history was more distant than modern history, and therefore one looked forward to doing something that was, in some ways, new and different. The other thing was also that, now that I look back on it, this was when I joined college, or was about to join college. I hadn't quite joined. There was a gap of 6 months between the end of school, as in those days you finished school in December, and the university colleges opened in June. So I had 6 months of what I thought was going to be marvelous vacation. It didn't turn out that way, because my father, who was a great one for picking up hobbies here and there and getting quite intensely involved in a hobby, went to Madras on tour. He was a doctor in the army, so he had to do a lot of touring. And he had an afternoon free, and someone suggested go to the museum. And he went into the gallery that had the South Indian bronzes. And he was completely taken aback by the beauty of the bronzes. He hadn't ever been told that these objects existed, you see. So he bought up a whole pile of books and came back to Pune, where he was posted and where we were living, and started reading. And then after a fortnight or so, he said, I can't just do this reading on my own. I need to have someone to talk to about it. So my mother immediately said, no, my sister was there and she was about to have a baby. And my mother said, no, both of us are going to be completely tied up with this, you see. And then he looked at me and said, you're on vacation. So I had to say, yes, all right, I will. So I started reading chapters of books on art history, Indian art history. Art history didn't capture my attention all that much, but the history behind it began to make an impact. And that was, I think, the reason why I, at that point, then decided that maybe I should find out what are the possibilities of doing early Indian history in a new way. That was what was being emphasized by everybody. That if you go to the SOAS in London University, it'll be very different from how you're taught and what you're taught here. And I was interested in finding out what the difference was.
Right. So, and after you went abroad and you studied, you decided to come back. And as you mentioned in Just Being, you took up a position in Kurukshetra University,
That's
which was not really a university, it was
Yeah.
just coming up. And there's some lovely anecdotes about you driving there and so on and so
Yeah,
forth and living on your own. So, how was that? I mean, why did you come back? I mean, when you obviously had the option of staying on if you wanted to.
Well, that's a subject that bothered me because every time things went wrong in Delhi or Kurukshetra, I would say to myself, now, if I was living in England, this wouldn't have happened. So there was that kind of feel. At the same time, I suspect that my generation was a generation of young, budding nationalists. We were shouting slogans all over the place, and we were constantly going to Gandhiji's prayer meetings and so on and so forth. And I think that was a kind of pull in the other direction, that you really do have something to contribute, which is important. And that sense of whatever the contribution may be, however limited it may be, there was that feeling that, all right, we've now got our independence. We're now building a new society. In what way can I contribute to that? So it was a bit of that.
Right.
But it was, I mean, these kinds of things carry on in life. You keep thinking, well, maybe if I hadn't come back, I would have got this. And maybe when you get this, you say, oh, well, I'm so glad that I came back because I got this.
No, because there's some other lovely anecdotes about how your car was towed by a bullock cart
That's
when you
right.
had gone off with your friends.
Yeah.
So obviously it was an exciting time in the
It was
60s.
it was exciting, and what was nice about it was that the living in India at that time meant that there were all kinds of unexpected things happening, which one didn't imagine would happen, which would have been expected in a society that was well run and so on. We were still in the process of looking at possibilities, and that was important.
You mentioned nationalism in your earlier comments and how, that your generation was inspired by that. And would you also say that yours was a idealistic generation, that you believed in change?
Oh, very much so. In that, for example, in my last year of school, I was then 15, I think. Suddenly one day, at the beginning of August, Sister Superior, it was a convent, a mixture of nuns and other secular teachers. And Sister Superior called me and said, we're going to have a little ceremony on the 15th. We will plant a sapling and we will change the flags. The Union Jack will come down and the Indian flag will go up. And we want you, as the Indian prefect, to make a little speech. And I was terrified. I sort of said, I can't do it. I went around sort of saying, no, what am I going to do? What am I going to say? How am I going to say what? Desperate. And my teacher who taught us history and literature, she said to me, don't flap. Just think of the conversations that you're having amongst yourselves, all the Indian girls who are coming to school, and tell us about those conversations, you see.
And do you remember anything of what you said?
There were 2 points I made, which I remember very much because I sometimes think that they bugged me all my life. One was, what is it going to be like to be an independent state after we've had colonialism for so long? And that was something that people were talking about. Ab kya hoga, kya badlega, kya nahi badlega, that kind of thing. And the second question was very much that of what kind of society are we going to create? Because it's now in our hands to make a society out of the way we're living. So that was also there.
Yeah.
So, and these are two problems in a sense, problems, ideas, which one lived with all one's life. I mean, it just became normal after 1947.
Yeah. So now we're doing this interview in this your lovely house, and as you point out in your autobiography, Just Being, you lived in this house for since 1967. So I just wanted to ask you. I mean, that's almost several decades of your life. And did this rootedness, because you travel also a lot, did this rootedness help you in understanding the world, understanding what you've done? I mean, does that help? Because you travel, as your book also shows, you extensively traveled, and I lost count of the number of friends you have abroad. So it's impossible to, yeah.
No, well, I made full use of all of that. I don't think that rootedness works one way or the other. I think the nice thing about rootedness is that if you decide to do something different and go off in another direction, you always have the feeling that if it doesn't work out, I can come back and do what I'm doing. It's the fallback position. It was always guaranteed to be okay, as it were. And sort of more so now, it was a middle class that was emerging in India. We were talking about new things, how to do new things, how to follow new agendas and that kind of stuff. So it was a sense of discovery despite the rootedness. And that sense of discovery was very strong.
And would you say as a woman academic, a woman public intellectual, would you say you had to work harder than men to achieve what you have?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, no question. I mean, when I was appointed to a readership at Delhi University, for example, one of my colleagues was constantly teasing, but not just teasing, and saying, you're doing a job that should be done by a man because a man has a family to look after and you're all alone. So it doesn't matter where you get a job, but it's important that a man should have this job that you have. That kind of thing, you're taking away the food from the mouth of a family, as it were. These kinds of jibes were fairly common in those days, said laughingly and treated as a joke. And you were meant to treat it as a joke, but it was hurtful.
And in your understanding of the world, I mean, what would you say are the key elements? Of course, your education, your interest in history, your delving into archaeology in so many places. You also mention in Just Being that when you had gone on a trip to China, you met Mao and Chao and Lai.
Right,
I mean,
yes.
that's something very few Indians may have done.
Yeah.
So, what would you say? Did your knowledge of archaeology, did your travel, did that enrich your intellect? Did it enrich your way of looking at ancient Indian or any other history for that matter?
Oh, absolutely. And that was very essential. I would say that the trigger was really curiosity to begin with. What happened in India in old times and what happened elsewhere in the world. Whether I learned anything from all of this is another matter, but nevertheless, there was intense curiosity. Um, in following up that curiosity, it was a case of, I mean, how did I get into archaeology? I did a little, we learned a little bit because you have to, if you're doing ancient history, archaeology is important. Back in Delhi, when I was reading more of archaeology, I found the reports technically a little difficult to follow because I didn't have any training in archaeology, any formal training. And I remember mentioning to one of the archaeologists in the archaeological survey, B.K. Thapar, that, what should I do in order to understand this? And he laughed and said, there's only one thing you can do, come and excavate. Because without that practical experience, you will go on feeling that somehow you're in an uncertain condition. So I said, what does that mean? And he said, over 3 years, every year for 3 months, you come to the sites that we're excavating. And this was Kalibangan in Rajasthan. And we will put you through the works, and you'll excavate different kinds of situation, objects in areas and locations and so on. And so I spoke to the head of department history in Delhi University and said, we were given 1 month off at Christmas. And I said, can I double up on the lectures and take a month at either end and spend it? And he said, talk to the students, which I thought was very unusual. But anyway, so I talked to the students and I said, can I take? And they said, yes, yes, of course, you take double the lectures for this month and that month, and you take the time off and go. Great fun. And then tell us all about it. So I did this 3 months of over 3 years of digging. And I did certainly learn much more about archaeology. I mean, I didn't become a first-rate archaeologist, but I learned much more, which was nice. And it also taught me that you don't just pick up something like, all right, linguistics is very important now in the study of Vedic Sanskrit. You don't just pick up a few things and say linguistics is important. You try and understand what the importance is. And it introduces a different kind of approach to understanding and to doing historical analysis in depth. And above all, it is something that prepares you for something that became essential as we in the 1960s, and that was interdisciplinary work. You didn't just stay with one discipline. If you were doing studying society in ancient India, you also studied some social anthropology. Not because you were going to apply it, point by point to history, but because it might give you suggestions and ideas for the kinds of questions that you could ask your sources. So, I mean, I have been accused by fellow historians who say, oh, you brought too much anthropology into your classes and into your books, which is really not so, because all I've done is that use interdisciplinary study, perhaps in a more meaningful way than if I had been without it.
I just wanted to return to the question of rootedness. Your family also has roots in what is modern day Pakistan, and you lived there as a child when your father was posted there. And we underwent, along with independence, we underwent the burden of partition, and perhaps in some ways we continue to suffer it, really. So would you say that the fact that your family straddled both sides of the subcontinent, literally, would you say that in your understanding of India or the subcontinent or Pakistan, would you say that this element of separation and rootedness, what role does it play in your view?
Well, I think now that I think back on it, I mean, it's not a subject that I've thought of very much, but still, now, yes. And also the fact that I made 4 visits
Yes.
for conferences and seminars to Lahore and Peshawar and so on. Lahore particularly. That whole sort of the life, and we used to go back every November. My grandmother had a rule. The 3 sons had these 3 suites of rooms. They were to bring their families and come and spend November in Lahore because, as she said very correctly, the cousins must grow up knowing each other. And I'm very grateful for that now, because much as I dislike this business of, oh my God, we're going back to Lahore again, can't we think of a new place for a holiday? But now I realize that, I have a certain closeness to my cousins, and it's simply because we all grew up together for at least 1 month in the year. So that was it. Rootedness, I think, everybody has it. You have to be rooted to some place. And I think what it did to me, the whole business of going back to Lahore and bringing Lahore, and then Lahore, of course, in a Punjabi family that lived there, partition died away, and what remained were all the mysterious mystiques and curiosities about what life was like across the border. And that became very important. Now, that's important in the sense that I think what it did with me was that it opened up the possibilities of mixed societies, plural societies. The pluralism that I inherited from that rootedness has stayed with me. And I think that that is very important, especially these days when there's so much emphasis on one culture, one religion, the singularity of everything. I just find it contradicts the fact that I have all my life found Indian culture and society to be a marvelously plural society. And that's been a great help to me in adjusting to life as I went along.
So interestingly, you have some interesting observations about family in your book. And you describe family relations as a gamble while saying that friendships derive from a greater freedom. And so, do you see any contradiction between family ties and friendships, or do they complement each other?
No, up to a point they complement each other. Now, whether this is something that, when you're growing up as a kid, you're always told, now you have to behave. That's part of family. Family becomes very conscious content in one's life. But I think also it's a case of, I mean, the thing that struck me very much, and I discuss it a little bit in that chapter, is that family is a given. You have a mother and a father and siblings, and God help you, you have to learn to live with them and take what they say. Whereas with friendships, you explore another person and you gradually begin to say, oh yes, I think I get on with this person. I think there's something meaningful in the friendship. And so friendships are much more chosen relationships, whereas family relationships are given. And you either accept them or you reject them.
The other thing which I wanted to ask you is, you also mention in your book, you write about London and Delhi. And if I may, be so bold to suggest that Delhi is your city because you are a Delhi wala, and you've lived here for so long that you know the ins and outs of the city. So at one place in the book, you write that in London, the attraction of new ideas and images is open, audible, and visible. In Delhi, however, you write, one has to explore the potential. Could you explain this point a little more?
Um, I think it depends on the area of Delhi that you're in and the culture. I should really have explained in that passage that the Delhi of the cantonment and of Lutyens, New Delhi, was really not such a curiosity because one had lived in that ambiance all one's life till one went to college. Even then, university, when you went abroad, it changed. So there was that Delhi, which was familiar, and one could participate in it quite fully. There was the other Delhi. When I was younger, for us, the other Delhi was Old Delhi because hadn't been the cantonment so much. It was a very small cantonment. The buildings and the so-called colonies today, which have come up, there were very few. I remember when my father wrote and said that he'd bought a plot of land in Chanakapuri. Everybody wrote to him and said, "Have you gone mad? That's the wilderness. It's an absolute forest. What are you going to do there?" And so, for me, that typifies the kind of change, intensive, fast change that Delhi has undergone. And the change is a change that I'm not so happy with because I think that is a Delhi that I would like to see developing a little differently from the way it has developed. But the nice thing about Delhi in those days was, and not so much now, but then, was that you could sort of pick the kind of culture that you wanted to mix. And I mean, if you wanted to buy itar and have kebabs and biryani and so on, it was all there. You just had to make the effort to go there. And that was nice about Delhi. And similarly with London, the great parallels, or were at that stage. And in London too, there were pockets of people coming from the same area, living together, migrants coming together. I mean, you knew that the East End of London was really not quite the same as the West End of London. And yet gradually it changed. And today the East End of London is more or less the same as the West End of London. But that, I think, is one of the interesting characteristics of big cities, that you do find variety and difference from location to location within the city.
So, Professor Thapar, if we can now move to, your writing of history and your intervention in public life as a public intellectual. So, what is your sense? I mean, you've seen history, you've analyzed it, and you've never been a party member of any kind,
No,
from what I
no.
can recall. So, why does the right wing love to hate you?
Well, it's a curious thing. I have sort of thought about it a little bit, not too much, because I don't let it interfere with my life. It's something apart which I've dismissed since long. Um, to begin with, history is very important to the building of a society. So to the extent that there are some historian friends of mine that have argued that it's a tradition, what we call a historical tradition, is an invention. It probably never existed. Certainly its existence today is an invention. So history is a very important part of the new society that we are creating. And it is particularly important to nationalism, which is why today political parties that are not emphasizing nationalism so much are not emphasizing communalism and the single religion and the single society and so on. The political parties that are emphasizing Hindu nationalism have made it into an ideology that concerns the development and so on of the one religion, the one community, the one people, their culture, etc., etc. So there is, at the same time, the possibility of plurality, and yet the political choice is veering more and more towards the singularity of a particular religion and culture. Um, Now, those of us that argue that Indian culture and Indian history, therefore, also comes from a background that has a wide scale of interest, are disliked by those that want to make a singular uh, thing out of Indian culture. Indian culture consists of only one culture. That is the one religion. That is the religion of the larger community and that sort of thing. So, one of the reasons for the dislike of a person like me is because I write the history of a larger society, of a more open society. They would prefer it to be the history of a closed society, a majoritarian history that doesn't. So that's one reason. Um, the other reason is that when we start looking at history as an open society, we have to say that there was dissent and there was disagreement in the past from earliest times, that history was not just one idea that was believed in and continued and continued and continued. There were varying ideas, there was dissent, there were people suggesting contrary positions and so on. Again, people like me are arguing this point, and those that want a singular authority don't like the argument of this plurality. And it goes on like this in many things. I mean, it started quite simply with the textbooks that we wrote for the NCRT, you see. And what was their objection to my book? There were two objections. One was that I talk about the Aryans eating beef, for which there's lots of evidence, and I provided the evidence, but no, that has to be excluded. And the second was why was I saying that the Shudras were not very well treated? Again, there's so much evidence for that, but it's a preference. So it's really a case of a party wanting to impose a image image of society on the past and saying history supports this image, whereas some of us other historians are saying history does not support that image, it supports a different image. That's one of the differences.
So that's probably why they've been
Yeah.
after, and as you mentioned in just being that even after a subsequent lot of textbooks came out with which you had nothing to do, they still attacked
They
you for it.
attacked us.
Yeah. So do you also feel that, you know, we've seen a lot of changes since 2014? Do you see that there's like a de-intellectualization process going on in India? You know, will India ever be able to return to a democratic, secular, and equalitarian path, in your view?
That's it's very worrying. We've asked this question of ourselves many times. We do discuss it. Again, it's the case, you see, that if you have an approach, for example, take a simple thing, the question of migration. We are the kind of historians who say, yes, there were migrations. Okay, the Aryan-speaking people came in as migrants, and after that there were others that came, the Shakas, the Kushans, the Huns, and then the Turks, Turushkas. They were all migrants coming in. What did they do to Indian society? They opened it up in certain ways and introduced some new ideas, some of which were picked up and some were just dropped and forgotten. But there were new ideas, man. This worries them because for them it is essential to say that everything that's happened in India has a root in India and India is responsible for its production. Nothing came from outside.
And India is the Vishwaguru.
And India is the Vishwaguru. And India, therefore, should today not take anything from outside, because this is not so. And secondly, the corollary to that is that India is not only the Vishwaguru, but because it is the Vishwaguru in a way, it's also the society um, um, that clings to a single objective, and that clings, it explains everything due to that one rootedness.
So this obsession with the single, if I may put it, does that come out of a sense of insecurity, because you're always saying our religion is in danger, somebody else is multiplying? Is this some kind of insecurity?
I think it's the insecurity of not having the power that they wish for. I mean, ideally for the Sangh Parivar and Hindutva and so on, ideally India should be a society that's a Hindu society. And they are trying to bring it in and bring in the idea of a largely Hindu society. And if it doesn't work, yes, there is an element of a lack of confidence.
Because today the Sangh Parivar has untrammeled power. I mean, I don't think the RSS ever felt that, they would control, they have Prime Minister for 3 terms. Previously, they had Mr. Vajpayee. So they have everything under their control, the writing of history, the textbooks, excising, whatever people are learning. But still there is that insecurity that people don't really believe us, or, they have ideas which can be disturbing.
Or there is the odd person here and there which is giving a contrary explanation, and that explanation is not being totally rejected. That's a big fear, that there's a contradiction to what we are saying. And however much we may say that this contradiction is nonsense, it is there. People are talking about it.
Professor Thapar, I also wanted to ask you about your reference to the emergency and, today's India, because it is a bit problematic for people to understand, because Mrs. Gandhi wanted to give a legal veneer to whatever she did. So you write in Just Being that this time, since 2014, state control is tighter and with a clear-cut agenda. How do you think the current government has managed this without any legal sanction? Because the kinds of raids we see on people, the kinds of visits, people being picked up, or, parties being broken because, you don't toe the line of the BJP. So how do you see this?
Well, I think that it's been a traumatic experience for India, because India was used to being an open society, and now suddenly it's not so. And when I say it's a traumatic experience, what I mean is that it's something which might have been bewildering in the beginning, but people have settled down to it somehow. I myself don't understand why they have settled down to it so easily. There are, after all, lots of situations which are contrary, at least thought of as contrary, if not actually contrary. But the exploration of this alternative is not really being done in the kind of meticulous, detailed way that one would like it to be done. Now, I'm not saying here that crowds of people should get up and start shouting against anti-government slogans. That may or may not happen. But there should be enough people thinking about the possible different kinds of society that we could have, given what has happened in the last 10 years, given this background. Is it going to be a case of it's finished? We'll just go on being like this. Now, as a historian, I don't believe that. Because as a historian, I know that after a certain number of years, maybe a decade, maybe 2 decades, there will be change. There's bound to be change. History's only moved forward when there's change. The question is that in that period, who are the people that are going to discuss, discover, and implement the change? And that's where it will depend on whether it becomes a secular democracy or whether it moves into something much more severe, like, in the past, in the history of Europe, for example, the World War ended up with fascism. And there's extreme ideologies are always there in the background, anywhere in the world. So that is something that we should be thinking about and adjusting ourselves to. Do we want that kind of society? Do we not want it? If we don't want it, what do we do?
You referred to extreme ideologies, and it seems to me that the extreme ideologies are not confined to India.
No.
They're
Yeah.
everywhere,
Yeah.
including in the United States of America and
Yeah.
whatever we are seeing happening, in the Gulf region. So, what is your sense? Is this like a burst of history, or is it a trend which will continue? And as you said, nothing lasts forever. But in this case, it seems like a rather long moment of history.
Yes, well, one doesn't know. I mean, if you study history carefully, it's had some very long moments. This may be just one of those. Certainly, we've had some very long moments here in India. No, I think, I'm the kind of historian who doesn't believe in history working in bursts. I think history works slowly and gradually. It may change in a dreadful way, but one has to always remember that change is not permanent. There will be other changes that will contradict that change. Don't ask me what they are, because I haven't thought them out yet. But judging by history, I mean, in history, one of the most interesting aspects of studying history is studying this constant change that goes on.
And if you see the world, I mean, you look at the rise of China.
Yeah.
You see also what the United States is doing, not only to the rest of the world, but what it's doing to itself. So, what is your sense? Will this kind of global turmoil, this global disorder, will it continue?
It will continue until there is enough build-up to question it. When people feel that they are in a position where they can question it and say, wait a minute, we don't want this system, we want another system, then it'll begin to break down. But as long as people are satisfied, but here again, one really doesn't know what is happening today, because you have elections, and some people say they're absolutely fine, they're free, and everybody's voting the way they want to. There are other groups of people who are saying, no, these are all being managed, manipulated. So one doesn't really know. I mean, ordinary people like us don't know whether there's any manipulation going on or whether this is perfectly normal and manageable. That will only happen, one feels, or I feel, when it becomes much more intense. And then possibly you will have either this or that.
So, you seem to suggest that the only constant of history is change.
It's a very big constant.
It's a very big,
big constant.
Yeah. So, I'm not going to tire you further, but I must ask you, in the decades that you've lived, do you have any regrets personally? Anything that
about how I
about your life, what you could have done or what you didn't do, or you could have done better?
Not terribly much. And I think one of the reasons for that was the great breakthrough that many of us had with JNU, the building of JNU. That's been a very major part of the lives of many of us. And when I say that, I don't mean just building a new university and settling down in it and so on. It was the idea that we started with, many of us, in the initial years, the 1971, when the university got going. And people would ask us, what are you doing in this new university? What are you so excited about, see? And we would say, yes, we're building new courses and we're building new syllabi. Subjects are going to be taught in a different way, and there's a new approach to knowledge. It's very important. And with all that, there was also, we discussed in great detail, we will build a university that will prove to the world that Indian intellectuals and academics can produce a university which is as good as the best.
And you did. And you did.
And we did. I think so. I think we did produce a superb university. And therefore, also now, when one sees what has happened to the JNU in the last 10 years, at one level, it's heartbreaking. I mean, I stopped going to JNU because I can't bear the thought of driving through those places and meeting, people and so on with the kind of background that there is now. But personally, with all of us, I think, there was a touch of having done something quite spectacular, although we didn't recognize it as being spectacular at that time. Now we know that it was. So I think there have been activities of these kinds that in the building of a new society and a new culture, as it was after 1947, there was a tremendous feeling of we're doing something really worthwhile. We are intellectualizing generations of students. We're teaching them to think. And for me, that's the most important thing. As a teacher, I think that the only thing that I can really convey in my life is to teach the younger people how to think, what to think about.
Well, on that note, Professor Thapar, thank you so much for talking to Frontline. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. And I'm sure your book, your wonderful book, which I will ask you to write a little something for me later, is something which people will treasure and read.
Well,
Thank you so much.
I hope you're right.
Thank you so much. Thank you.